If you've been watching my channel for any length of time, you probably know that there are certain things that I have definitely made my personality. And maybe just as a test, I'm not gonna list those things. If you wanna read me to filth in the comments, please go ahead. But one of them is my love of witchy things. Witchy horror movies, and really just like witchy movies in general, speak to me on a personal level. I do practice witchcraft in my personal life, sure, but witch movies also have themes of repression, oppression, liberation, individuality, confidence, things that really stick in the teenage mind, and thus laid a foundation in my younger years into adulthood, where much like if something is gay, if something is witchy, I will give it a watch. I also feel like witch movies have a very interesting evolution through cinema history that both reflects societal pressures on women and femme-presenting people, as well as feminist movements throughout history. So I just wanted to walk through that timeline a little bit, share my favorite like eras of witchcraft movies, and of course share some of my favorite foundational witch movies. The origins of witchcraft movies is actually quite simple. Witchcraft was a definitive evil, opposition to the good, heroic protagonists of the movie. Think of films like The Wizard of Oz, which is not a horror movie per se, but extremely influential in how witches are represented in Halloween decor. Sickly green skin, a hooked nose, probably with a wart, black hair, and a shrieking, cackling laugh. It's kind of the most stereotypical evil villain look that you can think of, and it still prevails to this day. And the idea of this kind of witch is still seen in modern children's movies, because they're often told from a child's point of view. The witch is this like terrifying older woman who is probably not married, probably doesn't have children, probably hates children, basically the patriarchy's worst nightmare. Instilled in us from a young age, we're taught to be fearful of older women like this, rather than learning from them and their vast life experiences like matriarchal communities of the past. Sometimes though, early witch movies showed women as a victim of witchcraft. For example, in the highly influential film Hexen, the plot shows innocent women being coerced into practicing witchcraft. So these bad influences were something to guard against, lest you fall victim to them. This kind of narrative helped paint women as a victim to these evil influences, which men ran with, and spread propaganda-esque ideas about how women are just more susceptible to that kind of thing. But it still ultimately kept that if a woman were to fall victim to witchcraft, she would be punished to the highest extent, victim or no. And these are super important foundations for how the witch will evolve, because we're gonna end up coming full circle by the time we get to modern witch cinema. I'm gonna skip a good chunk of time here with reason. One, because I love like folk horror witch movies. Also because they're super influential to the witch movies of today. But the early days of like folk horror witchy movies still depicted witchcraft as something evil, but the representations got a bit more targeted. So the late 50s and early 60s saw the breakdown of the Hays Code and filmmakers' aversion to expressing kind of like religious themes in their movies started to break down as well. Foreign films were a lot earlier on the jump when it came to depicting witchcraft as an agent of satanic ideology. This did not start to occur in American mainstream cinema until the 50s and the breakdown of that Hays Code. But when this idea took off, a lot of movies in this kind of folk horror era pit pagan practices in direct opposition to Christianity specifically. In many of these movies, the church features heavily in the narrative, and sometimes you have someone, whether like a representative of the church or simply a person of faith, being the hero of the story. There also were some horror movies of this era that depicted more like witch trial times. So they were like set in the past, and the narrative was about a witch finder, somebody coming to town to sniff out the witchcraft in the community. And these were interesting because it oddly showed a different or like truer narrative of these witch trials, which was kind of surprising given this other side of the coin being like, if you practice witchcraft, you're in bed with Satan or whatever. They showed witch hunts for what they were, which were communities condemning innocent people to death, likely because of a simple rumor, or maybe they were doing something that they didn't like natural healing, midwifery, things like that. In these movies, like Witchfinder General, for example, the titular witchfinder is depicted as a cruel and villainous character. At no point when you see Vincent Price's character appear in that movie do you think, yes, he's a good guy, he is a hero. These movies were super interesting because they depicted a dark side of the history of witchcraft just in general. Innocent people being put to death because of manufactured fear in a community, and fear of women especially who did not conform to societal standards. In movies like Black Sunday, for example, to an extent we're shown right at the beginning of the film a woman meeting a very violent end, and we're kind of on her side as an audience. For a little bit, there were witchy horror movies that depicted witchcraft as an allegory for a woman's innate power and sexuality. This, however, began to wane in favor of the satanic narrative, especially in the 70s and 80s. So some important context when we're talking about the satanic panic era. In the decade or so before this era, the world saw the rise of modern witchcraft. We had foundational persons like Gerald Gardner, who arrived on the scene in the 50s, and by the 60s, what was known as the craft had spread to the US, and American practitioners like Carl Llewellyn were gaining popularity and spreading these new age ideas. Plus you had people like Anton LaVey, who released his still widely bought today, I can confirm this as a bookseller, Satanic Bible, which he released in the 60s. So we kind of have this scene being set of people in their daily lives starting to practice witchcraft or looking into practicing witchcraft, which meets these movies depicting these satanic narratives of witches post Hays Code. And these two fronts kind of meet up with the conservative movement, which brought, among other things, a push against advancements made by and for women in earlier decades. And this all kind of coalesced and hung out over a body of warm water and created the satanic panic hurricane. So witchy movies of this era, like Rosemary's Baby or Suspiria, for example, show a secret underground force or persons who are doing these awful things, making bad things happen, harming women and children, manipulating people, and basically reflecting the societal fears of secret satanic cults at the time. A big theme in witchcraft movies of this era was also this idea that a woman does not utilize her innate powers or call upon the powers of the earth for her rituals. Rather, a woman's power is something given to her by a man who is either literally the devil or an allegorical stand-in for the devil. So what I kind of classify as the new adult era of witchcraft is kind of like the teen witch movies, and I don't just necessarily mean teen witch as in literal teenagers. Sometimes yes, but not all the time. It's more of an idea. It's more of a state of mind. So these movies typically convey the struggles of girls, young women, navigating a society that doesn't want them to have power, wants them to be seen, not heard, soft. These stories feature young women finding witchcraft and using it as a means to gain power. Power in a society where they don't have any, really. So the witch has now become something powerful again. We're kind of going back to witchcraft being your own power, not something given to you by a man. So this witch of this era has survived the flames of the satanic panic era and has come forth stronger for it. And it was way more common in this era to see witchcraft as it truly is, something of nature, of the earth, not something connected to a completely unrelated institution like Christianity. The discovery of or embracing of witchcraft becomes an allegory for coming of age and the discovery of identity and power that comes from within, not something that is given to us by the patriarchy. So finally, we've arrived at the modern age of witchcraft films. And like I said at the beginning, we've come full circle in a kind of interesting way. The witch is now someone who becomes liberated from an oppressive society. But unlike the teen witch era, the modern witch is a little more violent about things in response to today's world where rights are being rolled back at the drop of a hat. The witch is kind of backed into a corner now and is lashing out. For example, in the remake of Suspiria, Susie embraces her new identity as Mother Suspiriorum and violently destroys the coven that was using the dancers for their bidding. Susie is the hero of her own story, but society doesn't necessarily get behind a witch like her. So instead of shrinking back, she embraces this immense power. And then something comes along like The Witch from Robert Eggers, where the earlier kind of like satanic origins of witchcraft have been subverted in a really cool way. So Thomasin, as we know, turns away from oppressive puritanical society and goes to the woods. In a cool twist, Satan becomes almost this white knight savior, rescuing Thomasin from a life of being seen and not heard. She chooses to live deliciously and descends, literally. So I feel like the modern era of witchcraft movies is kind of like the natural evolution from kind of like the confidence of like the teen witch era. So witches have the confidence now, and now we're using that. It's not so much about just finding the confidence, it's about using the power to directly challenge the patriarchy, to directly challenge oppression. We're aware of how misogyny, colonialism has diminished women's power in society, and we're gonna take it back by force. That's the vibe. And I think given everything that's going on, at least in the US right now, I can speak to that at least. This type of witch movie is only going to get more prevalent. I'd love to hear what your favorite era of witch movies are in the comments. And of course, leave your favorite witch horror movies in the comments as well. I love having a video I can go back to, or anybody else can come back to, just to peruse the comments and get suggestions for movies to watch. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, let me know if you would like more videos like this. I had a lot of fun making this one. I will see you next week with more videos. Until then, stay strange. Bye.